It's game 8 of the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren in Kazakhstan. We have seen so far 7 incredible games, 5 decisive results, and it's Jan Nepomniachtchi in the lead with 4 versus 3, all because of that game 7 in which Ding Liren had a nice chance to play for a win, but in time trouble lost the control. Was a heartbreaking loss. But that's how World Championships can be. Today it's round 8 and it's time to try to find its way back into the match. It's Ding Liren playing with the white pieces, opening with the move 1d4, knight f6, c4, e6. And now what they've been doing so far is surprising each other in the opening, and now Ding Liren goes for the move knight c3, which he had not played before in the World Championship match. He had opted for the London system, and that crazy idea in game 2 in which he played knight f3, d5, h3. But this time he had something in mind in the well-known Nimzo-Indian variation, knight c3, bishop b4. And now he goes for the Rubinstein variation, and after the move castling kingside, we do get a transposition to well-known lies from the so-called Samish variation, a3. And it leads to a very interesting imbalance with bishop takes c3, b takes c3. White has the bishop pair, but white has a nice pawn center. And particularly this variation has become popular quite recently again, thanks to the efforts of strong grandmasters like Grishuk and Caruana. And the main move here is c5, but Nepo obviously prepared also this system for the match. Goes for d6. And now, rather than developing the bishop to d3, first, white goes for knight e2. Interesting move, not revealing the intentions of the bishop yet. And one of the ideas is that the knight will come to g3. Black played c5, trying to fix the pawns on the c-file. Knight g3 and knight c6. In the majority of games, people have been playing bishop d3 now. Looks like a very sensible move. But here Ding comes up with a remarkable idea, but in a way also quite typical for a lot of these Nimzo-Indian structures. Plays here the very subtle rook move. What is this rook doing? Well, the rook hopes to get employed along the second rank without moving the bishop, because the bishop on c1 is boxed in by its own pawns. But hopefully these pawns can come forward very soon. It's a very useful move, rook a2. Black goes b6, very typical strategy. After trading off the dark squared bishops, the pawns are placed all on dark squares. White goes e4, opening up the path for the bishop. Bishop a6, very typical move. As if black does get some time, he will put a knight on a5 and put pressure against the pawn on c4. And now bishop g5. With the idea to play knight h5 on the next move, and you don't want to allow the doubling of pawns. This pin is very unpleasant, so black understandably plays here h6, questioning the bishop. But look what Ding had prepared. Pretty sure this was home preparation. He played here the move h4. And it's very interesting because today it was actually revealed that on Lichess this move had been tried recently in a game by two anonymous players rated around 1500. Very likely these two players were Ding Liren and his second Richard Rapport, because it's not a kind of line you would expect to be played by amateur players. It's very deep home preparation we get to see. And presumably black mixed up the lines here. He decided to take the bishop, which is not that bad itself, but it does make a lot of sense to try to open the center first, inserting the moves c takes d4 and c takes d4 before capturing. Let's see why. Because in the game there followed h takes g5. It's a piece sacrifice, but we will regain the piece. Black cannot stick to the extra knight, because the queen will come over to the h-file, threatening mate. And after f5, trying to be able to escape with the king, white has g6, depriving the king from the f7 square. So the idea is to go g6 here, covering the h5 square, so the queen cannot go there. But now g takes f6, queen takes f6. So at least the queen is close to the king to guard the king. There are no immediate mating threats. But Ding just continues here. Look, he plays e5. Incredible idea. Threatening the queen. And black should basically take that pawn. If you just move the queen away, there are a lot of problems as white's queen comes to f3, threatening the knight. And if the knight moves, the other knight comes into to e4 with the idea to come to f6. And here you see how nice it is that the h-file is open. D takes e5 on the board. We have a nice positional pawn sacrifice as here the move d5 is played. So let's compare this line with the line where black would have inserted the moves c takes d4, c takes d4. Then that entire concept would not make sense because the pawn on c3 covers the square. And now the knight cannot come to d4. In the other line, knight d4 would be really good. It's an active square for the knight. So there are definitely some issues here for black. But remarkably enough, black decided not to take the pawn on d5. I guess that after c takes d5, Nepo didn't like that bishops would come off the board, and white has plans of creating a passed pawn with still ideas to launch an attack, maybe queen g4, maybe knight e4, and so on. Still very complicated. And by the way, a move like rook a8, it's not too dangerous because there's always rook d2. So we see how useful that rook is. Let's see what happened in the game. Knight e7. And now, of course, black is about to increase the pressure against that pawn. But white goes d6, attacking the knight, threatening to take. But the knight comes in to f5. And of course, it would be great if black would be able to exchange pieces. But white has different ideas. Played knight e4, attacking the queen. And now the queen goes back to d8. It's probably the best square. The queen could also go to g7. But very likely the king would like to go there at some point and prepare to offer the exchange of rooks with rook h8. So queen d8 is probably a better move, and it also does keep an eye on that pawn on d6. And now very sharp position with a lot of ideas. But Liren plays in the most principled way, as he intends with the move queen d3 to swing the queen over to h3 and deliver checkmate either on h7 or h8. Now we see why king g7 is played here, so that queen h3 can always be met by rook h8. But white goes g4. Look, this knight is in trouble. There are not that many good squares for the knight to go to, but black had a nice response in mind here. Bishop b7, ignoring the threat, because if you do take the knight, there's e takes f5, and the knight on e4 is pinned, as the rook on h1 is still hanging. If the knight goes away, it's bishop takes h1, knight takes h1. And, well, it's a position with a rook versus two minor pieces, but that pawn chain looks very impressive for black. So Ding played differently. Played here the move rook h3, moving the rook away from that diagonal. And here we have a very big moment in the game, as black has to decide how to deal with a knight on f5. There are a number of moves. For instance, you could take on e4, and after queen takes e4, take with a knight on d6, threatening the queen. But after queen takes e5, f6 is forced. You go queen h2, threatening to enter with the rook. If rook h8, the rook can be taken, and the knight on d6 is still hanging. So that's why knight f7 is on the board in that case. But after rook h7, there is no immediate mate, because remarkably enough, the knight covers both the h8 square as well as the h6 square. But this looks incredibly dangerous. And for instance, after a move like f4, black will have to play very precisely in order to stay in the game. There are a lot of ideas. Imagine this rook will be able to come over to the h-file as well. I don't think this is a lot of fun to play from a practical point of view. So that's the reason Nepo didn't go for that line. He decided to play knight h4, which is a very interesting move. Although I should mention that it could be very interesting idea to sacrifice the knight on f5. So after the exchange of rooks on h8, gf5, ef5, there's quite a lot of compensation because the rook will come into play, the queen will come to h4, and white's pieces are not working that well together in a sense that you're no longer attacking the white king. But let's have a look at the game. Knight h4 and now g5. Critical moment, interrupting this diagonal, so the queen no longer defends the knight. Probably a move like rook h8 should be played, but it was not done by Nepo. It's still very complex. After move like queen g3, you have ideas to either take the knight on h4 or take on e5. Black is under pressure, although probably it's still holdable. Instead, bishop takes e4 played. Queen takes e4. And now the knight is in trouble, but Nepo's idea was to go knight f5. But he definitely misjudged the position. Not because of the move queen takes e5. There would be f6 and black is trying to survive here. The knight is all of a sudden quite stable on f5. And in case of queen h1, intending to enter with the rook on h7, there's queen takes g5. And the check is no longer dangerous as the king comes over to f6. But the move, which had been misevaluated, is the move rook d2. Finally, the rook comes into play, supporting the pawn, and this is very important. Knight takes d6 is not possible because of queen takes e5 check, and the knight is lost. So black is unable to take that pawn on d6. If you would take the pawn on g5, which was probably Nepo's original idea, there is queen takes e5 check. Move like queen f6 is never possible because of rook h7, deflecting the king from the protection of the queen. So you got to go f6, but now queen h2 is an excellent move. Once again, threatening to give check on h7. And now you cannot really cope with these threats. If rook h8, there's a brilliant sequence. Rook h8, queen takes, king takes, and after d7, the d-pawn decides. Instead, if no rook h8, but you go knight h6, there is f4, and the queen can no longer keep the knight defended. On the next move, there is rook takes h6. That's why Nepo instead played here rook h8, but it remains a mystery to me why Ding didn't play here this so natural move d7. It's absolutely game over here. This d-pawn forces the queen to stay there. If you try to become active with queen takes g5, well, you have a move like queen takes e5, f6, and now rook takes h8. You cannot take the queen. There's rook takes a8 and d8 queen on the next move. So you got to take, but then queen c7 and the d-pawn promotes. White's king is absolutely safe, being supported still by its bishop. That's a huge missed opportunity. Instead, Ding took on h8 immediately. And now after queen takes h8, it's a different story. He now pushed the pawn to d7. He still could have played rook d3, which is incredibly strong and decisive. After rook d8, there's rook h3, forcing the queen to go away. And now after queen takes e5 check, if you play f6, g takes f6, it's game over. Again, if king f7 is rook h7 with a devastating attack. If you take with the queen, we have once again that deflection motive, winning the queen. So d7 on the board, with a big threat of queen takes a8, by the way, removing the defender so that you prepare the promotion of the d-pawn. So that explains the move. Rook d8, queen takes e5 check, king h7. And now, interesting moment, because white played here queen h2. He's not interested in exchanging queens, obviously. King g7. And moves were repeated in order to get closer to the time control. Remember how bad that time pressure was in the previous game for Ding. And after repeating, he played the move queen c7, making a lot of sense, as otherwise the queen could have probably taken on c3 if the king would still have been on h7. And now after something like queen f8, it's a very difficult position for black still, but he is fighting. He could put the queen on e7, maybe attack the pawn. But instead, Nepo played here the move queen h4, giving up the protection of the rook. And Ding started to think, and he trusted his opponent. He didn't take the rook on d8, but let's have a look what could have happened in that case. Nepo's idea was to follow up with queen e4. And if you block with the bishop, it would lead to a repetition of moves only. If you go king d1, it's the same. Queen b1, king e2, queen e4. But there's rook e2, the best move. Then queen b1 is the only move. Black is a rook down, so checks are absolutely forced. Queen b1. If you go back to d2, it's queen b2 with a repetition. Rook c2 is the main move. If you take the bishop, the king will come back. Only check here is queen takes f2. But after king c1, the king is safe on b2. The queen can move away with check, d8 queen, game over. But rook c2, queen d1. And now, probably Ding thought rook d2. This is a repetition only. But here the decisive move. It's king e4. You walk away with your king, allowing black to capture on c2 with check. And now bishop d3. Fantastic line with the point that the checks are more or less over. Only knight d6 can still be played. And now king e5. You're just about to take the knight, run away, and the checks will be over soon. After which the d-pawn decides. Queen takes d3. Queen f6, check. King h7, d8 queen. And look at this king. It's in the middle, but it's no checkmate. If you go queen e4, it's king takes d6 and game over. The queens are protecting each other. If you go knight takes c4 instead, it's king f4. e5, king g4, queen e4, king g3. Checks are over, and white is giving mate on the next move. Or queens will be exchanged, but then white is still a queen up. Absolutely insane line. Typical example of trusting your opponent. And it's understandable. You're playing for the World Championship. You don't expect your opponent to make such a big blunder. Ding played instead king d1, anticipating any sort of trouble with queen e4 check. Wanted to run away, but after queen takes g5, black is back in the game. King c2, the king looks relatively safe. And now queen e7. So the d-pawn is still under control. The queen protects the rook. It's very difficult to break through. And white played here bishop g2. Very understandable move. Hoping that the bishop could come in to c6 to support the d-pawn. But look what both players overlooked now. The key move is knight d4. Sacrificing the knight, absolutely insane. With the point that after c takes d4, you have rook takes d7. Finally, black is able to get rid of that annoying pawn. And if the queen goes away, for instance, queen f4, there is c takes d4. And after rook takes d4, the key move is that the pawn on a3 can be taken. You don't mind rook takes d7 because of queen a4. On the next move, the rook will be recaptured because of the double attack. White has no choice. And this endgame with 5 pawns versus a bishop and 2 pawns is likely to end in a draw. Also after other moves like queen e5, you can play f6, queen e3. C takes d4, everything gets swapped on d4. But in the end, that pawn on a3 is hanging all the time. That's really crucial. It's an extra pawn. And that explains why the move bishop g2 is actually a serious mistake, throwing away the advantage. White should have played king b3. Absolutely insane move. But the king is safe there. And now all these ideas based on knight d4, they're not as strong because the king also protects the pawn on a3. And if black refrains from playing knight d4, we have ideas of playing bishop g2, bishop c6, getting a very nice grip thanks to the pawn on d7. And who knows, maybe there are later on ideas to launch the decisive king walk. King a4, b5, a6, grabbing these pawns looks decisive. But Nepo had a different idea. He played e5 instead, but now there's bishop e4. Hoping to take on f5 probably and simplify. But now after knight h6, queen takes a7. White captures that valuable pawn. Knight to g4. And still, it was never too late to put a bishop on c6. Remarkable why Ding didn't go for this line, because after something like e4, probably he was afraid that after queen takes b6, there are ideas to generate counterplay. But White's king is still relatively safe as it receives the support from the rook. And as long as everything is under control, Black's rook is unable to join the attack against the White king. The d-pawn is really strong. And now White has a very simple plan of bringing up the a-pawn, as the bishop does support both the a and d-pawn. In the game, Ding thought, let's play it in a clever way. Bishop f3. Believing that after knight f6, the knight is even on a worse square. We get the same line just with the knight being inferiorly placed on f6. But now we see the very resourceful Nepo sacrificing the knight on f2. With the idea that after rook takes f2, the rook no longer defends the pawn. And even before recapturing, there is e4. Excellent idea to attack the bishop. And if the bishop moves, we can take on d7. And there's a lot of counterplay because the bishop is out of play. Black's king is safe. White's king is not that safe at all. Rook e2, pinning the pawn on e4. And now f5. Look at this nice construction. It's a nice positional idea as the bishop has no good diagonal to work with. And Ding had like 5 minutes left to reach move 40. One more move. But then, once again, he started to think for a long time. And with only 4 seconds left on the clock, he played here the move queen takes b6. Which may seem as like a huge mistake because of queen takes d7. With the idea to give a check on d3. If the bishop moves, that the rook on e2 could be dropping. But definitely Ding's idea was to meet queen d7 with the counterattack of rook g2. So that if the bishop is taken, there's queen takes g6 and White still will win. Instead though, there's queen d3. If the king goes away, queen d6, very likely the queens will come off the board and the endgame should just end in a draw. This bishop is not good. The rook covers the a-pawn. And Black also has plans of just activating the king, followed by a pawn storm on the king's side. Instead, rook takes d7 was played pretty fast by Nepo. And now, well, there are still a lot of lines, but White is no longer better, actually. He played here the move queen b8 with the idea to go rook h2 and try to generate some counterplay along the h-file. But after queen d6, the queens will come off the board anyway. There was no choice because if the queen moves, there's e takes f3. The bishop is also hanging, so you got to take. And here, keeping the bishop on the board, it's probably not a clever thing to do. I believe the a-pawn is not dangerous. These pawns are really strong once again. King f6, king e5, and Black can steamroll. Bishop takes e4, practical decision. F takes e4, giving the bishop back. And after king f6, rook e8, we have a rook endgame in which White has an extra pawn, but it's a double pawn. It's not worth anything. The rook covers the a-pawn. The players agree to a draw here. What an amazing game with a lot of missed chances, particularly for Ding. Again, a heartbreaking result. Still, this time he got a half a point. But definitely the Chinese team will not be satisfied with the outcome of this game. And Ding is still a full point behind, 4.5, 3.5. So incredible chess. But I'm also curious to hear from you. What do you think of that leak in that opening preparation? It was not only in the line I just mentioned with that piece sacrifice that it was played on lead chess. There are also other training games in which the same two players played that move h3. So 100% sure this must have been played in online training games. I don't think it's very clever. How should I have done it instead? If you have any idea, please let me know in the chat. And anyway, tomorrow we'll be back with the coverage of Game 9. And one thing is for sure, the match is not over yet. See you tomorrow.